لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله.
So the question is it hypocritical if you're angry to hold it in? So I'll get Shaykh Yahya to answer the question. Shaykh Yahya and I, alhamdulillah, we've taught on every continent on earth except South America. We have plans this year to
Antarctica.
every inhabitant continent. And one of my life goals is to get Shaykh Yahya upset with me. And I've failed miserably. I've even tried to flat out just get mad at him. And once he actually told me that, what you said that day would have made me upset with you, but you're my friend, so I can't get upset with you. I was like, great. So, just bring it on. So, alhamdulillah. So, if Shaykh Yahya will answer the question, inshallah.
So actually in the Quran that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that the following verse, وَالْقَاضِمِينَ الْغَيْظَ وَالْعَافِينَ عَلَى النَّاسِ وَاللَّهُ يُحِبُّ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. He mentions it in a way of praising those who do these following three things. And the first step is those who suppress their anger. And the second is those who pardon. And then the third is those who show goodness and excellence to people. And so Allah wouldn't have mentioned it like that if it wasn't a beautiful and good and noble, virtuous thing. And, that perhaps that in their mind they're conflating between two things. There are statements of the people that came before us and that would say things like that if people that do things to make you angry and you don't become angry, that, what is the difference between you and an animal? Things of this nature, right? But what they mean by that is not that you don't suppress your anger. What they mean by that is that the purpose of what we're supposed to do in relation to anger is not uproot it. We're supposed to channel it, okay? And so that anger there's a divine wisdom in it, and we'll be looking at some of that tomorrow, inshallah ta'ala. But it has to be channeled in the right direction. So if people are meaning that, then that's one thing. But if they're meaning by that, oh, this is how I feel, I have to keep it real, how I feel, I'm going to express it. That's very different. That is a jahili, that pre-Islamic, ignorant type of way of looking at things. That is not how we understand things as Muslims. No, there are actually quite a few things that, just imagine that if everyone just said what came to their mind, is if someone didn't smell good next to him, like, you stink, like in front of everyone. Or if someone was, just like, you're bothering me, don't touch me, right? Or why are you, doing this? Or imagine if every time that we felt anything, you said it, right? That mentality doesn't sit right with the way we understand the deen, right? So that, I feel angry about it, and so I'm not keeping it real because you're suppressing feelings that you have and so forth. And if that is what is meant by that, I think that, obviously that is an extreme, and that there's no doubt that suppressing your anger is a good thing. Now, depending upon what that person means by that, and I have to look in detail to give them the benefit of the doubt. If they mean by that that the anger that we have is supposed to fulfill a certain function, which is one of the wisdoms, okay? In other words, that we're warding off harm from other people, from a state of being angered that overtakes us. If that is what is meant, that is something, different, because the whole purpose of anger is to protect ourselves from any type of imminent harm, whether it relate to that our physically being harmed or our reputation or something of that. But the key is that we be in control. So it depends on what they actually meant by that. But in general, is that suppressing our anger and being in control of it as opposed to being controlled by it is a virtue in this deen. And that uncontrollable anger, that as we will see, is very, very harmful. And this is the very first thing that Imam al-Ghazali does, is that he equates the source of anger to the fire-like nature and capability within the human being that opens up the door for shaitan to play with him, right? And so that if we're not careful, is that we can get ourselves in a lot of danger with uncontrollable anger. And this is why the very first step is to learn to suppress it so that we can control it and then have a response that is rooted in the direction of the intellect and the understanding of the sacred law. So the follow-up question is that at what point would releasing anger be something legitimate and okay, and sometimes something that we actually really need to do? These types of questions is that, they really actually take a long time to walk through the various scenarios, and they're best treated in that workshop-like scenarios where we can actually have discussion and follow-up and that type of thing, because you'll see is that the answers actually get very nuanced. Because the question was at first when can you legitimately release it, but then you mentioned the example of the debt. So that is a specific example of a time where that there very well might be that an approach that you take because you need the money, and that you are dealing with someone in a particular way to get a particular result, right? Correct? But before getting into that specifically, just in general, there's no doubt is that from the standpoint of principle, not all release of anger is something blameworthy. There are times where it's necessary, and there's something about when that this is the way that people are. If you have people working for you, and you know that they are lax and they need to get their act together, and you show that you are not happy with the situation, they tend to get their act together and to start doing the work. But again, and this is what we will end up talking about, it has to be that for the right reason, that in relation to the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, and in the right way. And so when you start to look at that how our anger should be, you realize we have a lot of work to do. Right? So you have to be very careful, right? Because then that you could show a lack of empathy towards these people that are working for you, and end up there could be a correct release of that anger that could potentially be a solution to the problem, but then you could go to an extreme where you showed too much anger, or to the wrong person actually wasn't their fault, or it wasn't at the right time, or it wasn't in the right way, or so forth and so on. All of these other ways that you could deviate from it. So it actually requires quite a bit of wisdom. So in principle, yes, is that it's fine that when there's a legitimate reason to do so, to release anger, right? But there's all of these other considerations that we have to take into place. As for the example that was mentioned, well, and then there's the other thing that what do you do if there are some people who don't have an ability to release their anger. And when you should release anger and you don't, that's actually blameworthy in the other direction. And then what happens then is that, as we will see, is that could get caught in someone's heart and turn into what is called hiqd, which is resentment and rancor. And then that leads to a whole bunch of other traits that are very destructive. And so sometimes not releasing a little bit of anger when we should, that by way of remissness, is also something that's blameworthy and potentially harmful for the individual. So what we're really striving towards is balance in this issue. As for paying back a debt, is that again, someone has to be very careful. What were the terms of it? So there's a legal dimension, and that what is that person's condition? And is it something that they're just being lazy and that they're being negligent? That's very different than someone who's really in straitened circumstances. And so it just depends on the state of the individual. It also requires us to have empathy. And that maybe if we really need that money and we feel these people are kind of like taking advantage of us, that type of thing, releasing that a little bit of, showing that we're frustrated and that type of thing is something that we need, could be considered to be potentially legitimate. But then it could also be taken out of control, where you become very angry at someone, where it actually becomes even an excuse to attend Jum'ah, is that if you know that there's someone who is hounding you for that's in the Shaykh, is that also in the Hanafi school? That if you know someone is يطالبك بالدين يعني لا تحضر الجمعة يعني.
There's some detail.
Okay. Anyhow, my point is that that's a very difficult situation, to be in, and this is why we have narrations that indicate to us that when we have the virtue of being patient with people in relation to paying back the debts, and that loaning people money and being patient with the paying back of that money, teaching us that virtue so that we can balance that with what we think is a legitimate response and so forth. So those are just basic principles, but then it really requires that application of those principles, and then someone's specific situation that they're asking about, there might be a number of other factors that would be very different in their circumstance, how they would implement those principles as opposed to someone else.
The debt question, there's just one thing which is, it's important always to keep in mind that one has the full right to seek one's right in Islam, right? So if I owe Nadir some money, it's Nadir's full right to seek his right, right? And Islamically, and this is often neglected when it comes to rights, it is actually at least disliked to allow oneself to be wronged. Right? There's a difference that maybe I forgot. Right? I was supposed to make a payment beginning of the month, but I didn't. I forgot, right? But I'm deliberately not paying. So see, Nadir sees that I just got a new $1,000 Turkish jacket or whatever, but I owe him money, right? So he knows that I know. And he needs the money. So it's wrong to allow oneself to be wronged, right? So that's important to keep in mind, because sometimes one harbors a lot of frustration, right? Even in family relationships, etc., that one has a right to seek one's right. It is disliked to allow oneself to be wronged, right? As opposed to when someone just forgot or whatever. So those are two important underlying. The third thing just to keep in mind is that we very often err on the side of not consulting, right? And sometimes we get really worked up about a situation, that how come he didn't pay up? That sometimes just, and we get caught up in this, we don't know what to do, and it gets us even more frustrated. That just consult somebody. And you consult, and sometimes the most obvious answer, which is, did you remind them? So, oh, I didn't. So why don't you remind them? So, so it opens a door of facilitation. Maybe they can help you, etc. So those are just three things to keep in mind. We'll take one more question and then. Okay. Although, okay, now there wants to add some Hyderabadi commentary. One thing, sometimes, a benefit of consulting, for example, in an angering situation, when I was in Damascus, this one brother, his landlord was withholding he'd paid some money up front for some renovations, and the landlord just wouldn't do it. So he said, what do I do? So I don't know. Let's go ask Abu Munir, who's the personal attendant of one of the big scholars. He said, how long have you asked your landlord? He said, I've been asking for the last 2 months. He said, where do you live? He said, okay, come back tomorrow. I said, why? We're going to fix it. So Abu Munir is this really spiritual guy. He calls some tough guys in the neighborhood who just went to give the guy a warning that do this by this time or else, ... Next day, it was all taken care of, right? That's sometimes the benefit of consultation. So.
لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله